Hello, my name is Sara Stephens. I'm a research coordinator at Baylor College of Medicine and a PhD candidate in epidemiology at UT Health here. Today, I'll be presenting a project entitled Gestational Age as a proxy of arterial fragility in Vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So, as we all know, patients with VEDS have a significant risk of spontaneous vascular dissection and rupture. And there are a few tools for clinicians available to be able to risk stratify patients with VEDS beyond their genotype, meaning that it's difficult to fully predict or more accurately predict outcomes in these patients without these tools. And we also understand that affected neonates are more likely to be born prematurely, which is suspected to be secondary to an increased amniotic sac fragility, which the sac being made by fetal cells. And we actually saw this from a recent paper we published. So for this study, our aim was to evaluate the association between preterm birth and experiencing a vascular or organ event before the age of 30 years, really to see, is this helpful in predicting these outcomes earlier in life? We hypothesized or thought that lower gestational age at birth would be associated with the severity of VEDS presentation, specifically by either earlier occurrence or increased frequency of major events. So for this, we collected data retrospectively, meaning when we enrolled patients, we asked them about their history. And we included patients in either one of two cohorts that either had a pathogenic or a likely pathogenic COL3A1 variant, or alternatively, they had a deletion of COL3A1. We first included subjects that were enrolled in a prospective study looking at patients specifically with VEDS. And for this, they received a standardized interview by staff. We also included patients that we were unable to enroll in this study using an approved waiver of consent that allowed us to look at their medical records for the purposes of research. So the primary outcome was arterial or aortic dissection or rupture, as well as hollow organ rupture or collapse. And we looked specifically at whether or not they had this before age 30. And it was dichotomized, meaning we looked at, did they have the event or did they not? And then we defined preterm birth as birth at less than 37 weeks gestation. So we first conducted something called chi-square analysis to see if people that were born preterm had a higher frequency of events. All analyses were stratified by the COL3A1 variant type. So those that had a glycine missense or a splice site variant were considered to have a high-risk genotype, whereas those that had a null or what we call haploinsufficient variant or a deletion of COL3A1 were considered to have relatively lower risk. And we conducted all analyses to keep the genetics or the risk conferred by their genotype constant between the groups. So for everything we present later on, we either have it in the high risk group or the low risk group. After looking at frequency of events, we then did more sophisticated analyses, something called survival analysis, that accounts for the differences in follow-up time and ages between patients. For example, a 5-year-old with 5 years exposure time could have different risk than a 20-year-old with 20 years of exposure time. So these survival analyses basically accounted for that. So here is a table of our overall characteristics of the group. I'm going to focus more on our overall group, which included 47 people, 70% of which were male. When we look at the type of COL3A1 variant these patients had, we see that 38 of them, so the majority of them, had either a glycine substitution or a splice site variant. So most had a high-risk genotype. However, we also had 9 that had a null variant or a gene deletion. So it was 38 in the high-risk group and 9 in the low-risk group. When we look at how many had events in the overall group, we see there was about a quarter of them that experienced one of these events before the age of 30 years. And when we looked at the types of events that individuals had, we saw that 4 had an arterial dissection or rupture. There was 1 that had an arterial rupture. There was hollow organ rupture in 5. And then lastly, there were 2 individuals that experienced spontaneous pneumothoraces. When we looked here to see, was frequency of events associated with being born preterm, meaning did patients who were born preterm were they more likely to experience more events? And what we saw was that there were no differences in that. So we thought, okay, preterm birth is perhaps not associated in this group with the frequency. Now with that, here is a visualization of the percentage that had an event by preterm group and by genotype. So as we can see here on the left in the high risk group, there were 35% of those born preterm that had an event. And we can see this here in this red box. This was in contrast to about 22% among those that were born at term that had an event. What we saw was that based on our threshold of significance, this was not statistically significant, meaning that we did not see a difference in people that had an event versus those that did if they all had a high-risk genotype. Now, when we look here on the right, what we can see is that 1/3 of the patients that were born preterm had an event altogether in the low risk group. And this was compared to 0 of the patients that were born at term. Now with that, as we see here, this also did not meet our threshold, meaning these were not significant in this particular analysis. Here is something called a Kaplan-Meier curve, and this was produced with survival analysis. So to provide some context for one, on each of these curves, you see on the horizontal axis here, their age in years. On the y-axis is something called freedom from event. So it's saying at time 0, at birth, 100% of the patients were free from the event. And as we can see, as time goes on, these decreases in the curve indicate that someone had an event. So for example, there's an event here at perhaps age 13 or 14. There's an event here at age 4. And so what this means is that those in the red here that were born preterm had events significantly earlier than those that were born at term for everyone who had a high-risk genotype. And this was significant, meaning that we saw a difference based on our threshold. When we put this into terms of, so what does this mean exactly, or how else could we explain this? What we saw was that among patients who had a high-risk genotype, those that were born preterm had 5 times the risk of experiencing an event before the age of 30, compared to those that had the same high-risk genotype, but they were born at term. And what we saw, and what this suggested, that preterm birth might be a helpful predictor for those that have a high-risk genotype. I'll explain some caveats later, and then on the right here, what we see among the fewer patients with a low-risk genotype is that, for one, there's no significant difference in how early events are between the 2 groups. We saw that one of the 2 patients that were born preterm had an event, and this was compared to none of the patients that were born at term. Now, because we didn't see any events in the term group, that means, unfortunately, we were unable to perform this same type of analysis to ascertain the risk. So the study was limited by small sample sizes, as we saw, one due to the rarity of VEDS. We also had limited racial ethnic diversity in our sample. And lastly, because of the small sample size and something called low power, we were unable to control for multiple factors at once. So overall, what does this mean? What we concluded was that children with VEDS that were born preterm and with a high-risk COL3A1 variant demonstrated higher risk of having an event before age 30 compared to those with the low-risk group who were not born preterm. However, that said, because this is a smaller sample, there are additional studies needed with improved power and more people to further see if this holds true in other and larger groups. With that, thank you for your time. If you have any questions about the study or are interested in enrolling in our research, please feel free to contact me at the email at the bottom of the slide.